Scientology is a body of religious beliefs and practice created in 1954 by American author L. Ron Hubbard. After he developed Dianetics, the Dianetics Foundation entered bankruptcy and Hubbard lost the rights to his publication Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health in 1952. He then recharacterized the subject as a religion and renamed it Scientology, retaining the terminal doctrines, the e-meter, and the practice of auditing. Within a year, he regained the rights to Dianetics and retained both subjects under the umbrella of the Church of Scientology. In this best-selling book, Hubbard wrote that he had isolated the dynamic principle of existence, which he states as survive, and presents his description of the human mind. He identifies the source of human aberration as the reactive mind, a normally hidden but always conscious area of the mind, and certain traumatic memories called engrams stored in it. Dianetics describes counseling or auditing techniques which Hubbard claimed would get rid of engrams and bring major therapeutic benefits. Hubbard was criticized by scientists and medical professionals who charged that he presents these claims in superficially scientific language but without evidence. Despite this, Dianetics proved a major commercial success on its publication, although employees have stated that these figures were inflated by Hubbard's Scientologist-controlled publisher, who had groups of Scientologists each purchase dozens or even hundreds of copies of Hubbard's books, and who sold these back to the same retailers. This is unprovable, though, since Dianetics itself became a bestseller long before Scientology had ever been conceived. Biographical accounts published by the Church of Scientology describe Hubbard as a child prodigy of sorts, who rode a horse before he could walk and was able to read and write by the age of 4. A Scientology profile says he was brought up on his grandfather's large cattle ranch in Montana, where he spent his days riding, breaking broncos, hunting coyote, and taking his first steps as an explorer. His grandfather is described as a wealthy Western cattleman from whom Hubbard inherited his fortune and family interests in America, Southern Africa, and etc. Scientology claims that Hubbard became a blood brother of the Native American Blackfeet tribe at the age of 6 through his friendship with the Blackfeet medicine man. However, contemporary records show that his grandfather, Lafayette Waterbury, was a veterinarian, not a rancher, and was not wealthy. Hubbard was actually raised in a townhouse in the center of Helena. According to his aunt, his family did not own a ranch, but did own 1 cow and 4 or 5 horses on a few acres of land outside the city. Hubbard lived over 100 miles from the Blackfeet Reservation. While some sources support Scientology's claim of Hubbard's blood brotherhood, other sources say that the tribe did not practice blood brotherhood, and no evidence has been found that he ever had been a Blackfeet blood brother. Between October and December 1928, a number of naval families, including Hubbard's, traveled from Guam to China aboard the cargo ship USS Gold Star. The ship stopped at Manila in the Philippines before traveling on to Qingdao in China. Hubbard and his parents made a side trip to Beijing before sailing on to Shanghai and Hong Kong, from where they returned to Guam. Scientology accounts, on the other hand, say that Hubbard made his way deep into Manchuria's western hills and beyond, to break bread with Mongolian bandits, share campfires with Siberian shamans, and befriend the last in the line of magicians from the court of Kublai Khan. Hubbard's war service has great significance in the history and mythology of the Church of Scientology, as he is said to have cured himself through techniques that would later underpin Scientology and Dianetics. According to Moulton, Hubbard told him he had been machine gunned in the back near the Dutch East Indies. Hubbard asserted that his eyes had been damaged as well, either by the flash of a large caliber gun or when he had a bomb go off in my face. Scientology texts say that he returned from the war blinded with injured optic nerves and lame with physical injuries to hip and back, and was twice pronounced dead. His medical records, on the other hand, state that he was hospitalized with an acute duodenal ulcer rather than a war injury. He told his doctors that he was suffering from lameness caused by a hip infection, and he told Look magazine in December 1950 that he had suffered from ulcers, conjunctivitis, deteriorating eyesight, bursitis, and something wrong with my feet. He was still complaining in 1951 of eye problems and stomach pains, which had given him continuous trouble for 8 years, especially when under nervous stress. This came well after Hubbard had promised that Dianetics would provide a cure for the very ailments that plagued the author himself then and throughout his life, including allergies, arthritis, ulcers, and heart problems. In late 1948, Hubbard and Sarah, his wife, moved to Savannah, Georgia. Here, Scientology sources say he volunteered his time in hospitals and mental wards, saving the lives of patients with his counseling techniques. Hubbard began to make the first public mention of what was to become Dianetics. He wrote in January 1949 that he was working on a book of psychology about the cause and cure of nervous tension, which he was going to call the Dark Sword Excalibur, or Science of the Mind. In April 1949, Hubbard wrote to several professional organizations to offer his research. None were interested, so he turned to his editor, John W. Campbell, who was more receptive due to a long-standing fascination with fringe psychologies and psychic powers that permeated both his fiction and nonfiction. Campbell invited Hubbard and Sarah to move into a cottage at Bay Head, New Jersey, not far from his own home at Plainfield, New Jersey. In July 1949, Campbell recruited an acquaintance, Dr. Joseph Winter, to help develop Hubbard's new therapy of Dianetics. And Campbell told Winter, with cooperation from some institutions, some psychiatrists, Hubbard has worked on all types of cases: institutionalized schizophrenics, apathies, manics, depressives, perverts, stuttering neuroses, in all nearly 1,000 cases. But just a brief sampling of each type, he doesn't have proper statistics in the usual sense. But he has one statistic. He has cured every patient he worked with. He has cured ulcers, arthritis, and asthma. Hubbard collaborated with Campbell and Winter to refine his techniques, testing them on science fiction fans recruited by Campbell. The basic principle of Dianetics was that the brain recorded every experience and event in a person's life, even when unconscious. Bad or painful experiences were stored as what he called engrams in a reactive mind. These could be triggered later in life, causing emotional and physical problems. By carrying out a process he called auditing, a person could be regressed through his engrams to re-experience past experiences. This enabled engrams to be cleared. The subject, who would be now in a state of clear, would have perfectly functioning mind with an improved IQ and photographic memory. The clear would be cured of physical ailments ranging from poor eyesight to the common cold, which Hubbard asserted were purely psychosomatic. Hubbard expanded upon the basics of Dianetics to construct a spiritually oriented, though at this stage not religious, doctrine based on the concept that the true self of a person was a thetan, an immortal, omniscient, and potentially omnipotent entity. Hubbard taught that the Thetans, having created the material universe, had forgotten their godlike powers and become trapped in physical bodies. Scientology aimed to rehabilitate each person's thetan to restore its original capacities and become once again an operating thetan. Hubbard insisted humanity was imperiled by the forces of aberration, which were the result of engrams carried by the immortal thetans for billions of years. Hubbard introduced a device called an e-meter that he presented as having an almost mystical power to reveal an individual's innermost thoughts. He promulgated Scientology through a series of lectures, bulletins, and books such as A History of Man, a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years, and Scientology 8-8008. With this book, the ability to make one's body old or young at will, the ability to heal the ill without physical contact, the ability to cure the insane and the incapacitated is set forth for the physician, the layman, the mathematician, and the physicist. In February 1953, Hubbard acquired a doctorate from the unaccredited Sequoia University. According to a Scientology biography, this was given in recognition of his outstanding work on Dianetics and as an inspiration to the many people who had been inspired to take up advanced studies in this field. The British government concluded in the 1970s that Sequoia University was a degree mill operated by Joseph Hugh, a Los Angeles chiropractor. Miller cites a telegram sent by Hubbard on February 27, 1953, in which he instructs Scientologist Richard D. Mill to procure him a Ph.D. from Hugh urgently, for gosh sakes, expedite work here. For gosh sakes, expedite work here, utterly dependent on it. Hughes University was closed down by the California authorities in 1971. British government officials noted in a report written in 1977, it has not and never had any authority whatsoever to issue diplomas or degrees, and the dean is sought by the authorities for questioning. A few weeks after becoming Dr. Hubbard, he wrote to Helen O'Brien, who had taken over the day-to-day management of Scientology in the United States, proposing that Scientology should be transformed into a religion. As membership declined and finances grew tighter, Hubbard had reversed the hostility to religion he voiced in Dianetics. His letter to O'Brien discussed the legal and financial benefits of religious status. The idea may not have been new. Hubbard has been quoted as telling a science fiction convention in 1948, "Writing for a penny a word is ridiculous. If a man really wants to make $1 million, the best way would be to start with his own religion." Scholar Joe Gordon Melton notes there is no record of Hubbard ever having made this statement, though several of his science fiction colleagues have noted the broaching of the subject on one of their informal conversations. The Church of Scientology has denied that Hubbard said this and insists it has a misattributed quote that was said instead by George Orwell. Hubbard outlined plans for setting up a chain of spiritual guidance centers, charging customers $500 for 24 hours of auditing. "This is real money. Charge enough and we'd be swamped," he wrote. Scientology franchises became churches of Scientology, and some auditors began dressing as clergymen, complete with clerical collars. If they were arrested in the course of their activities, Hubbard advised, they should sue for massive damages for molesting a man of God going about his business. A few years later, he told Scientologists, if attacked on some vulnerable point by anyone or anything or any organization, always find or manufacture enough threat against them to cause them to sue for peace. Don't ever defend, always attack. Any individual breaking away from Scientology and setting up his own group was to be shut down. The purpose of the suit is to harass and discourage rather than to win. The law can be used very easily to harass, and enough harassment on somebody who is simply on the thin edge anyway, well knowing that he is not authorized, will generally be sufficient to cause his professional decease. If possible, of course, ruin him utterly. The 1950s saw Scientology growing steadily. Hubbard finally achieved victory over Don Purcell in 1954 when the latter, worn out by constant litigation, handed the copyright of Dianetics back to Hubbard. Most of the formerly independent Scientology and Dianetics groups were either driven out of business or were abandoned or were absorbed into Hubbard's organizations. Hubbard marketed Scientology through medical claims, such as attracting polio sufferers by presenting the Church of Scientology as a scientific research foundation investigating polio cases. Scientology became a highly profitable enterprise for Hubbard. He implemented a scheme under which he was paid a percentage of the Church of Scientology's gross income, and by 1957 he was being paid about $250,000 annually, equivalent to $1.9 million at 2010 prices. By the start of the 1960s, Hubbard was a leader of a worldwide movement with thousands of followers. The Church of Scientology says that the problems of this period were due to vicious, covert international attacks by the United States government, all of which were proven false and baseless, which were to last 27 years and finally culminated in the government being sued for $750 million for conspiracy. Behind the attacks, stated Hubbard, lay a vast conspiracy of psychiatric front groups secretly controlling governments. Every single lie, false charge, and attack on Scientology has been traced directly to this group's members. They have sought at great expense for 19 years to crush and eradicate any new development in the field of the mind. They are actively preventing any effectiveness in this field. Hubbard believed that Scientology was being infiltrated by saboteurs and spies and introduced security checking to identify those he termed potential trouble sources and suppressive persons. Members of the Church of Scientology were interrogated with the aid of the e-meters and were asked questions such as, "Have you ever practiced homosexuality?" and "Have you ever had unkind thoughts about L. Ron Hubbard?" For a time, Scientologists were even interrogated about crimes committed in past lives. "Have you ever destroyed a culture? Did you come to Earth for evil purposes? Have you ever zapped anyone?" He also sought to exert political influence, advising Scientologists to vote against Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election and establishing a Department of Government Affairs to bring government and hostile philosophies or societies into a state of compliance, complete compliance with the goals of Scientology. This, he said, is done by high-level ability to control, and in its absence by a low-level ability to overwhelm. Introvert such agencies, control such agencies. The U.S. government was already well aware of Hubbard's activities. The FBI had a lengthy file on him, including a 1951 interview with an agent who considered him a mental case. Police forces in a number of jurisdictions began exchanging information about Scientology through the auspices of Interpol, which eventually led to prosecutions. In 1958, the U.S. Internal Revenue Service withdrew the Washington, D.C. Church of Scientology tax exemption after it found that Hubbard and his family were profiting unreasonably from Scientology's ostensibly non-profit income. The Food and Drug Administration took action against Scientology's medical claims, seizing thousands of pills being marketed as radiation cures, as well as publications and e-meters. The Church of Scientology was required to label them as being ineffective in the diagnosis or treatment of disease. For the first few years of the 1980s, Hubbard lived on the move, touring the Pacific Northwest in a recreational vehicle and living for a while in apartments in Newport Beach and Los Angeles. In Hubbard's absence, members of the Sea Org staged a takeover of the Church of Scientology and purged many veteran Scientologists. A young messenger, David Miscavige, became the Scientologist de facto leader. Mary Sue Hubbard was forced to resign her position, and her daughter Suzette became Miscavige's personal maid. For the last 2 years of his life, Hubbard lived in a luxury Bluebird motorhome on Whispering Winds, a 160-acre ranch near Creston, California. He remained in deep hiding while controversy raged on the outside world about whether he was still alive, and if so, where. He spent his time writing and researching, according to a spokesman, and pursued photography and music, overseeing construction work and checking on his animals. He repeatedly redesigned the property, spending millions of dollars remodeling the ranch house, which went virtually uninhabited, and building a quarter-mile horse racing track with an observation tower, which reportedly was never used. He was still closely involved in managing the Church of Scientology via secretly delivered orders, and continued to receive large amounts of money, of which Forbes magazine estimated at least $200 million was gathered in Hubbard's name through 1982. In September 1985, the IRS notified the church that it was considering indicting Hubbard for tax fraud. Hubbard suffered further ill health, including chronic pancreatitis, during his residence at Whispering Winds. He suffered a stroke on January 17, 1986, and died a week later. His body was cremated and the ashes were scattered at sea. Scientology leaders announced that his body had become an impediment to his work and that he had decided to drop his body to continue his research on another planet, having learned how to do it without a body.